It was a Christmas Eve much like any other. Well, when you've been through a few thousand of them, they all start to blur together. Foggy nights, stormy nights, and nights quiet enough to hear snowflakes shifting in the wind. Santa had seen it all. So, as he pulled the sleigh in for a landing atop a row of houses in Quinlanburg, he thought nothing of the empty streets and the pale green flames adorning the street lamps. It was most likely the locals getting into the Christmas spirit. A bit unusual, but variety was the spice of life for Santa. After all, not every day could be Christmas. The sleigh groaned under his weight and that of the bulging sack of toys. I'll need the elves to look into that, he mused to himself. After all, hearing the creaking of a sleigh a few billion times would be enough to drive anyone mad. He made a note in the side margins of his sprawling delivery list to bring it up when he got back. He sighed as he saw it under the previous notes to pick up milk and laundry detergent. There was truly no rest for Father Christmas. The air was crisp and the snow crunched with each booted step until he finally reached the chimney. Using the magic of old, Santa dropped his ornately ordained velvet bag into the chimney and quickly followed suit. The ride down was smooth as always. The magic turned each chimney, stove, or furnace into a luxurious elevator ride down. Santa was no fool and quickly learned that there were easier ways than breaking and entering. As the elevator slowed and chimed the three-bell herald, Santa hefted the bag onto his broad shoulder. His button nose twitched as he picked up a strong smell of iron and what was that? Sulfur? He must have ended up in an old cast iron stove with a side of eggs on top. While he appreciated alternatives to the stereotypical cookie, who in their right mind would leave eggs out? He made a mental note to dump the reindeer's waste in the yard. The polished wooden doors of the elevator slid open easily, and Santa could scarcely believe the sight before his eyes. His normally rosy cheeks drained of color, and his jaw dropped. A man and woman lay at his feet. The glow from the hearth illuminated their ghastly forms. They each wore a mask of terror, and the hollowed-out eyes told a grisly tale. Each was covered in blood and gore, with ragged holes dotting their pale flesh. The man's abdomen had been ripped open, and his entrails were strewn across the floor. Following them to the woman's body, Santa could see her outstretched arms reaching for what he could only assume was her husband. Scratches were in the hardwood floor directly in front of her, and upon closer inspection, Santa could see that her nails were either broken or missing entirely. As his eyes wandered down her form, he saw that her entire lower half was missing. A trail of blood led down a dark hallway with tiny footprints on either side. The flames from the fireplace flickered and the logs cracked. Santa's merry heart filled with dread as unearthly shadows danced along the blood-flecked walls. It was then that Santa realized the crackling wasn't from the fire. It was coming from further within the house. Gingerly he set the bag of toys down and craned his neck to listen. The elevator doors began to close and then stopped, chiming as they detected Santa was standing over the threshold. The crackling stopped. It was replaced by a light pounding on the floor. It was as though someone had wrapped a pillow around hammers and was furiously beating the floor. Suddenly, two children burst from the shadows of the hallway. Their tiny pajamas were caked in blood and their hair encrusted with it. Their once innocent eyes were filled with hate and malice, burning with a supernatural fire. They shrieked like banshees as they sprinted towards the elevator. Santa panicked, stumbling backwards. With him clear, the doors began shutting slowly, too slowly. The small boy leapt at Santa, drool flying from his crimson lips. Santa screamed, instinctively kicking out. His stomach turned when he heard as much as felt the heel of his black boot crunch against the youth's face, pulverizing his nose in an eruption of blood. As the blood landed on the floor, it smoldered like bubbling pitch. The boy flew backwards into his sister, who was only a few feet behind. The doors closed, and the cheery instrumental of Holly Jolly Christmas began playing. Santa's frantic heart was threatening to burst from his chest. A cold sweat matted his silvery locks to his pasty head. What in the name of Saint Nick was going on? Within seconds, the elevator was at the top of the chimney, and Santa was belched out in a puff of black smoke, along with his bag of presents. The grisly scene on the rooftop was even more horrifying than to the bearded gift-bringer. Sitting within the snow, he stared in abject horror at the carcasses of his reindeer littering the rooftop. Their legs had been broken in multiple places, and the bones jutted at terrific angles through the skin. Piles of intestine lay amongst the gore strewn about the rooftop. The steam from their still warm bodies radiated in the cold night air. Looking past them at his sleigh, Santa could see large, ugly letters carved into the front. Krampus. No. No, 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 no. Santa shook his head in quiet disbelief. This wasn't right. He and Krampus had never quarreled, and in times of old the two of them covered most of Europe together. He wasn't the most talented conversationalist, and his fur reeked of rotting wildebeest, but Santa had always admired Krampus's dedication to his work. It wasn't easy being the villain. For countless centuries, Krampus had been an enforcer, punishing the wicked children of the world. Santa had seen firsthand the ritual abuse naughty children would suffer at the beast's hands. It was a terrifying ordeal, to be certain, but Santa couldn't argue with the results. Children visited by Krampus tended to wind up on the nice list in the following years. It always started the same. Oversized and rusty, pitted chains would be heard clanking and crashing violently against the floors of the child's bedroom. Like a melting painting, the colors of the wall adjacent to their bed would run. Slowly, a dark spot would form on the wall. This circle would become darker and grow in size until it stretched from floor to ceiling. A horrible guttural roar could be heard echoing from the spot, which was now a black void. A small, cold wind carrying the stench of decay would blow forth as the roaring intensified. 2 burning yellow eyes would appear within the black depths. Pure malevolence radiated from those eyes. Santa had only made the mistake of looking into them once. His blood ran cold for months afterwards. He couldn't even imagine the terror that a child must have felt. As the eyes bobbed and floated in the dark, leaving behind a ghostly trail, a tremendous roar would erupt and the chains would shoot forth from the void, wrapping around the bed. The chains would constrict tighter and tighter, causing the wooden bed frame to creak and groan loudly. Digging grooves into now warped wood, the rattling chains would begin dragging the bed toward the monster contained within the void. When the bed was only a few feet away, Krampus would emerge. As he crossed the threshold from his realm of nightmares to that of reality, his hulking form would be engulfed by a baptism of flame. Krampus easily stood at 9 feet tall, and his swept-back curved horns added another 2 feet to that. More often than not, he would have to hunch over while the tips of his horns dug into the ceiling above, leaving scratches that the child would have to stare at while they lay in bed until their parents repaired the ceiling. With one swift motion, Krampus would snatch the child up by their arms, hoisting them out of bed. His mighty hand would grind their tiny wrists together, causing undeniable agony. Holding their now screaming and flailing bodies away from his own, Krampus would rear back with his thin bundle of birch branches and savagely beat the child. Over and over, the thin reeds would lash against their tiny bodies, and after Krampus had dealt what he deemed appropriate justice, he would drop the child into their bed in turn, returning once more to his hellish domain. The wall would heal itself as the hole shrank into the nothingness from whence it came, and the colors ran up to their original place. The cold snow began seeping into the thick fabric of Santa's trousers, snapping him out of the memories. Standing slowly on uneasy legs, he brushed the wet snow from his pants. His usually jolly heart was completely devastated as he looked over the broken remains of his reindeer. For generations, the reindeer had always been his constant companions. Over the many years, they had always been there for him. And now? Now their empty eyes stared back at him. For all the magic and miracles he had worked over the span of his very long life, there was no way he could bring them back. Gingerly stepping past their broken forms, Santa made his way towards the sleigh. The light powdery snow shifted under the weight of each careful step. The large, crudely carved letters stood in stark contrast to the bright red paint of the sleigh. As he drew closer, Santa could see the normally plush interior had been shredded. Tufts of stuffing lay about haphazardly, and the dark leather was split open in several large areas. Santa's mind flashed back to the parents in the home beneath him. With the reindeer dead, he would need help getting out of here. He didn't know what was going on, but it clearly wasn't safe for him to stick around and find out. Leaning around the edge of the opening in the sleigh, Santa's heart sank. Much like the seat, the dashboard, which housed all manner of sophisticated navigation and communication equipment, had been destroyed. Burnt wires stuck out from the wooden panel, and blackened circuit boards could be seen beneath. Not deterred, Santa knelt down in the sleigh and shoved his gloved hand under the seat. After several exploratory pats, his fingers found what he was looking for. Pulling out the long silver tube, Santa mused to himself. The tube was ornately decorated with images of ships, crashing waves, fire, and lightning. The elves always mocked me for things like this. They rely too much on technology. Inevitably, it always fails. But magic never fails. He freed the feet from their holster on the bottom and planted the tripod on the snowy roof. There was a slight hum as the device extended 6 feet upwards. Santa stared at the rod, whose hum was turning into a high-pitched whine. Taking a step back, Santa shielded his eyes at what was about to come. There was a crackle in the air, and Santa could feel his hair start to raise up. The whine was growing louder and louder. Santa stood firm, but was hoping if there were more creatures like those inside the house, that they weren't being drawn by the device. It doesn't matter. If this doesn't go off, I'll be stuck here. The device suddenly went silent, and Santa was snapped out of his thoughts. He covered his ears just before a crackling boom rang out. The deafening sound was combined with a brilliant flash of blue light, and Santa was knocked on his backside. Blue electricity arced along the length of the staff before culminating in a blue flame stretching far into the sky. Following the trail upwards, the blue flame turned into a purple plasma stretching as far as he could see. Down below, Santa could hear doors crashing open and high-pitched screams emerging from inside. I guess they did hear. Time to get moving. The rod crackled and hummed. Awkwardly getting up, the ancient man began to run away from the rod, his sled, and the corpses of his faithful reindeer. He silently sent up a prayer, hoping their spirits were at rest. The rooftops were slick with snow and ice, but millennia of treading all manner of roofs granted Santa a near supernatural grace as he dashed across them. There was nothing he liked about the older European villages, and even the modern-day apartments. It was just a matter of parking the sleigh in one spot and making his way across, down, and through. It was an incredibly efficient way of delivering gifts. Crouching to keep low, Santa continued to run along the rooftops. The snow muffled his boots, and he used this to his advantage. Making his way to the end of the block, Santa stopped and edged his way to the corner of the building. Cautiously, he peered over. Below, droves of the possessed children fled their homes and headed toward the beacon he had planted. The lot of them looked very similar. A blackish ichor bled from their soulless eyes and mouths. Their skin was paler than a ghoul's and had a sickly green tint. Blood-covered pajamas and bare feet pounded along the frozen cobblestone streets without a care. The beacon would only draw their attention for so long. He needed a place to hide. But where? There was a smaller town, and it was teeming with children. While the beacon was loud and drew them to it, it wasn't loud enough to alert the entire town. Complicating matters, there was no guarantee they wouldn't lose interest and come back this way, only to find him hiding in some attic. Well, can't stay up here all night, old man. Yet the same snow that had worked to his advantage earlier now disguised the encroaching children. They came at him fast and hard. One landed on his back with a screech while another clawed at his boots. Santa spun with the momentum and let out a cry of surprise. He was stumbling backwards from the weight of the child on his back when he saw another. The boy wore ill-fitting pajamas whose buttons were threatening to burst from the immense strain of trying to contain his girth. Blonde curly hair adorned a pudgy face that was grunting like a wild boar. The boy charged at Santa and his compatriots. The stocky youth slammed straight into Santa's gut and threw him completely off balance. Letting out an oof, Santa tumbled backwards and over the edge of the building. Tiny claws were digging at his thick clothing, and screams rang in his ears for a second before he hit the ground. There was a sickening crunch of bone as Santa crushed the 2 children that had been on his back. He was wheezing and fighting for breath when the fat one on top of him snapped back to its vicious senses. It started clawing at his chest in an effort to reach his face. Drool was running down the boy's chin and empty eyes pierced his being. Putting an arm up to defend himself, Santa yelled in pain when the boy bit into it. He wasn't able to break through the thick, tough fabric, but it hurt nonetheless. Santa struggled under the weight of the boy and reached down to pull the survival knife he kept in his boot. St. Nicholas, forgive me. Santa screamed out and buried the 5-inch blade into the side of the boy's head. The attack stopped immediately, and the black eyes rolled up into the boy's head. As the body truly became a corpse, the dead weight nearly crushed Santa. With a grunt, he rolled off the 2 children beneath him and slid the heavier child to the side. Santa scrambled to his feet and leaned against the side of the stone building. Laying before him on the sidewalk were 3 dead children. 2 had been crushed by his own body, and the 3rd had his knife protruding from his skull. Santa's eyes drank in the sight of the crumpled, broken bodies, which caused him to double over. He retched and cried, emptying the contents of his stomach. Tears streamed down his face, only to fall and land in the steaming pile of vomit beneath him. It was a vicious cycle that repeated itself several times over. An ear-piercing scream rang out and was joined by another, and then countless more. The unholy choir was making its way down the street toward Santa. He turned and looked down the street, but couldn't see anything. A fresh wave of terror washed over him, and he began running. His mind was filled with visions of the infernal creatures leaping at him from the rooftops, while others chased him down in the frozen streets. Santa hurried down the street, past darkened homes and shops. The only light available to guide his way was the pale moon above and the haunting glow of the green street lamps. His black boots plodded against the stone street and became heavier with each step. His heart hammered in his chest, and the fat encompassing his body hurt with each jolting drop. Sweat was pouring down his face, and his breath was drawing short. "Santa!" A whisper shouted in from the shadows, and he nearly missed it. "Santa!" Santa skidded to a halt and looked around frantically. He could hear the screams of the children growing louder. "This way!" A gruff voice shouted behind him, while strong arms grabbed him around the chest and nearly hauled him off his feet backwards. He was too tired and shocked to fight it. He was yanked off his feet with a powerful tug before being engulfed in darkness as a door slammed shut in front of him. Another rough hand covered his mouth while the gruff voice whispered in his ear. Past the locked door, Santa could hear the screams of children build in intensity as they approached. It became a near deafening cacophony of sound, and he wanted to close his eyes in terror. Instead, he saw their tiny forms run past. What little light illuminated the drawn curtains showed dozens of spectral shadows surge past the building. After a minute, their voices faded into the distance. By now, his eyes had adjusted to the dark, and Santa could make out the shapes of several people around him. The strong hands that had clamped over his mouth and around his chest let go. "His beard is soaked with sweat," came the disgusted voice of a woman. "His back isn't any better, but it's definitely not sweat," said the gruff voice in an equally disgusted tone. "What in the holy fire is going on here?" Santa said as he got to his feet and began stumbling away from the group. "Be quiet, you daft old man," a third voice hissed at him from the shadows. "They'll come back around and kill us all if you're not quiet." The gruff voice cut back in. "Hey, that's no way to talk to Santa." The third voice was condescending. "You can't actually believe that, Santa. It's just a fairy tale." "So is the thing that turned our children," was the soft retort from the woman. There was an undeniable rage to the third voice. "Krampus? The thing that turned our children into monsters? He's as good as dead when I get a hold of him." "How do you kill a fairy tale?" asked the gruff voice. "Why don't you ask Santa here?" The third voice was getting worked up. His voice was already tense, but the pitch was rising. Santa approached the group slowly. He dug into his pocket and pulled out a small vial. Grabbing a small bowl from a nearby table, he laid it on the floor in the center of the group. Pulling an ornately embroidered handkerchief from his breast pocket, he held it up against the opening of the vial and gave it several hard shakes. The cloth was soaked by the time he placed it in the bowl. Before the group could ask him what he had done, the soothing scent of frankincense wafted up and reached their noses. Composing himself, Santa then spoke in a low, gentle tone. "Firstly, you have my thanks for rescuing me. I don't know what I would have done had you not intervened." "Probably died," was the snide but calmer remark of the third voice. Paying it no mind, Santa continued, "Can anyone please tell me what happened, when it happened, what the plan is?" There was a long pause of silence, and then the gruff voice piped up. "It happened a few nights ago. Near as I can tell, and based on what the others have said, it was that night. My wife and we put our boy down the same time as usual. We had finished hanging up the last of our decorations, and he was giddy for you to arrive, sir. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of my boy screaming. I rushed to his room, but the door wouldn't open. It's not like it was locked. We didn't have locks inside the house. But it wouldn't budge. I'm not a small man by any stretch of the imagination. So when I tell you I couldn't bust the door down, you'll begin to understand how wrong our situation is. I could feel a heat coming through the door as I ran my shoulder into it. I damn near threw it out of socket, but I could hear my boy screaming. I just couldn't give up. The other unusual bit was that this green glow coming from underneath the door. It felt like forever that I was beating against the door. My wife was next to me, worried sick. Then he went quiet. The second he stopped screaming, I broke through the door as if it were nothing. My boy, he was lying on his bed. Susan ran in. She wrapped her arms around him, and he was crying and asking what was wrong. I was right there. His eyes opened up, but it wasn't him. His eyes were blacker than the night sky. Before I knew what was going on, he latched onto her throat. She tried to scream and pulled away. He pulled too. There was blood everywhere, and she fell to the floor, grabbing at her throat and shaking. I looked at my boy. He still had the bit of flesh hanging from his mouth when he pounced at her. I grabbed him, held him tight against me. I held my boy while he screamed and fought. At my feet was his mother, my wife, dying in a pool of her own blood. The man trailed off. Halfway through telling his story, he had begun to cry. It was soft at first, but it was growing harder for him to speak without sobbing. He stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The woman next to him wrapped her arms around him and held him tightly. Her voice was soft and held the same pain that his had. It was the same for all of us that night. Something came after the children in this town. It changed them. He changed them. How do you know it was Krampus? Santa asked. Sick bastard couldn't resist signing his own work. She practically spat the words out. The children carved it into the walls. It all happened so quickly. It was late at night, and then our babies were attacking us. Those without, they tried to call for help, but couldn't get anything. The television, computers, phones, just static. It's like we'd been cut off from the rest of the world and put into this private hell. Those of us that survived, we banded together. Clearly our children were sick. We wanted to believe there was a cure. We tried to restrain the children, but they're so fast, so strong, and so incredibly vicious. We had to... She began crying too. Santa's heart sank. You had to put them down. His mind flashed back to the 3 children he left dead in the street. He made us kill our own babies! Her voice contained nothing but fury. The third voice chimed in. In the gloom, Santa could see that he was an older man, thin and with silvery hair. So many of us couldn't do it. We couldn't help the children, nor could we hurt them. So we did the only thing we could do. We ran and hid. Some tried to leave the town to get help, but they had blocked every exit. Despite being like rabid dogs, they were organized. It was peculiar. Couldn't even get through the woods. Every effort made led to more people dying. Eventually, the three of us were all that was left of our initial group. I don't know what happened to the others. For days we've been chased all over town. I haven't slept since the attack started. We can't keep this up. As he took their horrific tales in, Santa focused inward. As he concentrated, he began to radiate an aura of calm. More accurately, it was the sense of Christmas cheer. However, given the circumstances, it could only do so much. When he finally spoke again, his voice was confident and reassuring. You won't have to endure much longer. Help is on the way. I've planted a beacon. The elves will follow St. Elmo's fire here. It shouldn't be much longer now. Once we're away, I'll be able to get help in stopping Krampus. The gruff man and woman looked at him with tear-filled eyes. Despite the horrors they had witnessed, there was a small glimmer of hope in them. Thought I had gone crazy. The daft fool actually believes he's Santa. Santa's patient and worn out. His tone was flat and his eyes bore into the older man. Timothy, up until the age of 9, when you stopped believing in me, you asked for a castle, toy soldiers, a wooden horse to ride, a bike, a pellet gun, and finally a knife. Your parents always sent a second letter with yours asking that I try and find a spot for you on my good list. The years leading up to your 9th birthday, you couldn't do a single nice thing. While your parents bought you many nice things, I always left coal in your stocking. Timothy's eyes widened, and his jaw dropped. He began to stammer, but Santa cut him short. You can either choose to believe in me or not. I don't much care either way. What I do care about is getting you out of here. You may be a rotten person, but no one deserves this. Santa stood and dusted himself off. He looked around in an effort to get his bearings. The elves will be headed straight to the beacon, which I left at my sleigh. However, I suspect that it has also attracted the attention of Krampus and his minions. If they land there, it will be yet another bloodbath. We need to get to the rooftops and intercept them before that happens. They'll be coming in from the north. Is there a way we can move across town? The trio sat in silence, contemplating. After a long pause, they looked at one another and then Santa, before shaking their heads. Unfortunately not, sir. Even if we were to use the rooftops, they're broken up at the streets. We're close to the northern side of town, but there's a bridge that separates us from the outside. Santa pondered for a long while and stroked his beard while he did so. Mrs. Claus always chided him for doing so and warned him not to. She believed he would pull out all of his hair that way. As he twirled a white curl around his finger, the thought struck him. He disappeared into the back of the house. The group could hear a faint rumbling as he searched. After several minutes, the man in the red suit returned with several bottles of liquor in each hand. Timothy looked at him with an annoyed expression. What are we supposed to do with those? Drink ourselves to death before they find us? Santa let out a long sigh. He briefly considered throwing the man outside. No, these... He began ripping up strips of cloth from the dining room table and stuffing them into the bottles. Will be a distraction. With the last of the rags in the bottle, Santa produced an old metal lighter. With a deft flick of the wrist, it snapped open and the warm glow shone on his face. As the flame flickered, he could see the despair etched into their gaunt faces. These people had tried. It was now up to him to save them. With a plan in place, Santa gently opened the front door. He peeked his head out and glanced in both directions. He couldn't see any of the children about. There was a sharp metal click, and Santa took several running steps out the door before hurling the flaming cocktail down the block and into a window. What had once been a shop burst into flames. Leading the trio out the door, they bolted into the streets and then an alley. Out in the street, they could hear the children screaming with hunger. Their shrill voices carried loudly in the chilled night air. From the shadows of the alley, the party first heard and then saw the hordes of children flood towards the burning shop. Seizing the moment, they rushed on. Each carried a weapon, though they had silently vowed not to use them unless absolutely necessary. The gruff man carried a heavy sledgehammer. He was bundled in a blood-covered gray wool coat. An ashen scarf was wrapped around his neck and half his face. Black leather gloves gripped the handle of the hammer tightly, and pale blue eyes scanned the shadows intently. His short auburn hair clung to the top of his head. He scouted on ahead, and once the coast was clear, he waved a muscular arm, ushering the group ahead. The woman stayed close at his side. She was thin and wore an old-fashioned blue dress with gray pinstripes. Her brown hair had been tied up in a messy bun. Thin black mascara had run down her face and drew one's gaze to her emerald eyes. She wielded a dented wooden bat in her offhand as she threw another cocktail across the street and down the adjacent alley. Once again, they could hear the howls of the cursed children. As their attention was drawn away, the group backtracked through the alley and took another route north. Timothy crept forward to the corner of the alley. They were at the end of their cover. A block away lay the bridge. The children were nowhere to be seen, but Santa knew they were about. He glanced at his watch and winced. Help should be here soon, but they needed to hurry. Looking into the sky, he could see the St. Elmo's fire burning brightly into the heavens above. Timothy nodded back to Santa, who gave him the sign to proceed. As Timothy stepped out to hurl his cocktail, a gargantuan clawed hand darted in and scooped him up. The old man screamed out in pain as the hand wrapped tightly around his chest squeezed. An unholy roar rang out, and the remaining three in the alley winced. Krampus! Santa's mind was in a state of panic. Run! Timothy cried in agony as the horrible beast squeezed. Using the last of his strength, Timothy threw the bottle down at the creature's feet. It burst into flames all around, which began licking at the thick fur of the creature. It howled out with a blood-curdling cry and flung the old man into a nearby wall. His body hit the snowy sidewalk with a thud. Dead. While this was happening, the gruff man ran past Santa and the woman. Using his considerable strength, he slammed the hammer into the door of the building they were behind. It crashed open with a terrific noise, and he was yelling for the other two to run. Grabbing Santa by the sleeve of his jacket, the woman pulled him back down the alley and into the building. It was another shop, and Santa nearly jumped out of his skin. What he thought were more creatures were actually mannequins. The clothing store was still neatly organized, oblivious to the carnage that had consumed the remainder of the town. The gruff man let out a heroic shout and charged the front door, knocking it off its hinges with one mighty swing. Santa couldn't hear Krampus any longer, but he could hear the screaming children swarming their way. His breath puffed out in great white clouds. Looking to his left, he saw the bridge. Santa began running. They had to make it. Before he was half a dozen steps out of the clothing shop, a shrill scream rang out behind him. As he turned, he saw several small hands wrapped around the woman. Their fingers dug into her flesh and pulled her back into the darkened shop. Sarah! The gruff man shouted as he hurled himself back into the shop. No! Santa shouted, trying to stop the man. As much as he wanted to save the woman, he knew it was a lost cause. She would be dead within moments, and there was nothing he could do to save her. As if to confirm his thoughts in a sick fashion, the shop burst into flames. The man had used one of the bottles he carried in a selfless act to stop the encroaching horde. Santa's heart broke. There had been so much death and suffering since he landed here a scant few hours before. Still, their deaths wouldn't be in vain. Santa took the opportunity and sprinted towards the bridge. He would get out of here. He would call in help, and they would stop Krampus. Santa huffed with each laboring step. The bridge lied just ahead. He would need to fire another beacon to reroute the elves, but he was right there. He began reaching into his pocket for the flare gun he had found whilst in the home. It was then that several long talons peeled across his back and sent him flying. They were razor sharp and easily sliced through the thick coat and several layers of skin underneath. Santa cried out in shock before slamming face first into the street. The blow had knocked him several feet ahead. His mind was a blur of pain. Struggling to get to his hands and knees, Santa looked behind him. With blood dripping from his claws stood Krampus. The fur covering his body danced like flames in the cold wind that blew. His wolf-like face snarled and thick muscles twitched. Rearing his head back, he let out a deafening roar. His mighty horns swayed and bobbed in a mesmerizing way. All around him, children began to emerge from the homes and streets. There were dozens of them, all warped and twisted by the nightmarish creature. They gathered behind him, soulless puppets waiting for their master's word. Santa could only look on with abject horror. As he shuffled backwards, Santa held up the flare gun. He had it pointed straight at the awful beast's chest. While doing so, he realized he was moving uphill. He was on the bridge. The creature and his minions began moving forward towards the helpless man. Santa panicked and did the only thing he could do. Why? The ragged shout caught the beast off guard. He stopped dead in his tracks. The children stopped with him. Why did you do this? What is the point in all this madness? As Santa's desperate plea reached the creature's ears, it began to chuckle. It was a low, disturbing sound that came from deep within his being and rolled outward. The children that stood behind him didn't laugh. They didn't smile. They did nothing. Answer me! The laugh stopped. I'm doing what I've always done. Krampus's voice was like gravel. Santa's back was bleeding badly, and he felt faint. As he stared at the unholy abomination and the poor children around him, he channeled this newfound hatred to keep himself upright. This is far from what we've always done. Is it? Krampus gave a mock shrug. I punish the wicked and undeserving. Since we were first conjured up in the minds of mortals, that has always been my role. Perhaps it is only you that has failed to notice, but my work has only increased. The number of naughty children has grown exponentially. Generation after generation grows petulant and greedy. No longer do they worry about being good. Instead, they expect everything handed to them, no matter how foul their behavior. Something had to be done. As the world grew, so did our work. You delivered more and more presents, while I punished more and more children. But we're on the same side, you and I. I do my work so there will be more good children in the world. I do my work until their moral compass is supposed to start working. But that is happening in fewer and fewer children. It is to the point that there is no saving this latest generation. And who's to blame? The beast looked at Santa with his horrible eyes. The parents. The same spoiled children that I punished so many years ago have grown and spawned their own useless offspring. From what I gather, they never learned their lesson. What am I to do? I was forced into this. They all needed to be punished. What better way to do it than to use the children? They served no purpose in life up till now. But now, their lives have meaning. The beast smiled. Yellowed razor-sharp teeth gritted together behind blackened lips. What you're doing isn't punishment. It's murder! Krampus cocked an eyebrow. What greater punishment is there than having to kill your own children? Had they done their jobs as parents and instilled good values instead of giving everything their screaming brats desired, this wouldn't have happened. The beast spoke with a fevered conviction. Had Santa been able to look into his eyes, he would see the utter madness dwelt there now. I'm sorry about what happened to you. I always liked you, Santa. I thought we had made a good team. But people forgot about me. It became all about the presents. When you wouldn't deliver, the parents would fill every greedy need. It's time they remembered. You were simply caught in the middle. No, you're wrong. Santa's voice was strained. His vision was getting blurry and his arms heavy. I'll put an end to this. The beast roared in defiance. He began charging with the corrupt children behind him. Using the last of his strength, Santa pointed the flare gun to the sky and pulled the trigger. A muted pop followed by a high-pitched whistle rang out. A brilliant explosion of crimson light and smoke burst forth overhead. As the flare hung there, it cast everything in the street in a hellish light. Just as the monstrous creatures were nearly upon him, fire rained down from the sky. Through his blurred vision, Santa could see the beast howling in pain. Behind him, the corrupt children screamed out in agony as well. A wall of flame roared in front of them, preventing their progress. Santa was falling, but tiny hands caught him. He was being pulled into a sleigh, loaded in the back, where the elves immediately began working on him. He could hear their frantic shouting, and the sleigh jumped to a start. Reindeer furiously kicked at the air, driving the sleigh high above. Below him, Santa could hear the beast and his minions screaming out in rage. The cool wind whipped by as the sleigh cut through the air. Far below him, the green lights of the town were fading away. The medic struggled to stabilize Santa. He could only make out bits and pieces of what they were saying. His voice was weak, and he couldn't move. In the fog of his mind, he tried to give voice that Krampus needed, but he stopped. His lips fumbled with the words, and then his world went black.